Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year's. I want to welcome you to the Mastermind Parenting Journey. And today with me is Dr. Brenna Hicks from America. Hi, Dr. Brenna. Thank you so much for having time with me today. Would you like to say a little bit? Yeah, my pleasure. Would you like to have some introductions about you with our audience?
Sure. So I live in Florida and I own a children's therapy center where we specialize in play therapy. So we are registered play therapists and it's mental health care for 3 to 14. So kind of a very specialized niche. And then also in the parenting expert space with podcasting and books and things like that. But definitely my passion is play therapy.
Wow, it sounds very cool, like play therapist. Can you explain a little bit more? What is that?
Sure. So we are trained to understand what children bring to therapy through their play. So we have fully equipped playrooms and children come in and we have a phrase that we use that play is their language and toys are their words. So they're not verbal at those ages. So they can't sit down and tell us what they're struggling with or tell us why they're angry, but they will play out those issues. And so we are trained to understand their play, interpret their play, and kind of serve as guide rails to get them to a healthier place emotionally and behaviorally.
Wow, yeah, it sounds very, very interesting because if I imagine right, it's like, when you are very small, you don't have enough vocabulary to really say what you want, but you know how to express it one way or another.
Right. And play is the natural language of children. So they learn about the world that way. They learn about their feelings that way. They learn about social cues that way. So it would make sense that in a therapeutic setting, they would be able to do the same thing with the therapeutic guide to help them overcome some of those struggles.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And this is the first time I hear that you have play therapists. Very cool. Yeah. And I know that you have a book about devices, this detox device. And for me, nowadays in the new media age, the number of screen time for everybody, adult and children, increase crazy. Could you give some explanation as why we are so addicted to devices?
Sure. Yes, it's kind of an unspoken epidemic, I feel right now. And there's a lot of children that are being exposed to screens at younger and younger ages. And, when I think back to when I was growing up, I didn't even get a cell phone until I was 18. And so to have children that are being given phones at toddler levels, it's been such an increase in screen exposure. And unfortunately, as far as the addiction piece, what's going on is, and I talk about this in my book, the tech companies, so all of the major corporations, big tech, if you will, they have brought on psychologists and neuropsychiatrists and gaming experts, addiction experts. They've brought in experts in the field specifically to make the games, the devices, the notifications, the dings, the sounds, the lights, everything that goes on when we are staring at a screen, it's purposefully addictive. And what research is showing is that when they map the brain, so they look at dopamine in the brain, they look at adrenaline in the brain, and the pleasure centers, they are seeing the exact same response when people are using devices as they do in addicted individuals, such as with drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. So the exact same addiction principles are carrying over at a neurotypical level as within the addiction field, which is really scary to think that we have 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds that are given tablets or phones or access to screens, and it's starting at such a young age, that propensity for addiction.
Yeah, but okay, so when we use the addiction word, so when a child already addicted to the device, how can we kind of take away the device from them? Because I imagine you cannot just take it out.
No, and actually, this is sad. I don't even like to watch it. It actually kind of makes me physically ill. But there are lots and lots of YouTube videos where parents videotape taking the device away from a baby or a toddler, and it turns into a full-blown tantrum. Screaming, red face, snot dripping out of their nose. It's awful. And then they go, okay, and they hand it back, and the kid immediately goes, oh, and then they're fine again. And so, I mean, you can actually see evidence of it at a really young age that's been videotaped, and it's scary to me, but it's true. So unfortunately, you're right. You can't just take it away, because that's like taking away, you know, a bottle of alcohol from an alcoholic. There's the need and the want for it, right? And so that's a lot of what I talk about in the book is you have to have a system and you have to have a framework to find balance, because every child is going to have a different level of tolerance for screens. So some kids have a more addictive type of personality. They're predisposed to need and want screens more. You have other kids that would much rather go play outside and ride their bike than sit in front of a screen. So every child is going to have a different threshold for their tolerance for screen use. And so it's helpful to start with the guidelines. So the Pediatric Academy has actually provided guidelines based on age of how much screen time is healthy and safe. So they're saying 2 and under should have no screen time whatsoever. 3 to 5 can have up to an hour a day. 5 to 10 can have up to 2 hours a day. And so it's really kind of given based on age and what they can handle. So I always encourage parents to start there. So give that as a baseline and work backward toward that amount, because just taking it away cold turkey, you're going to be faced with a lot of meltdowns, a lot of tantrums. And so you want to have a plan, because my phrase is if you're going to try to succeed, you need to have a plan. So we want to make sure that we say, okay, our goal is X number of time a day. Let's work down to that, so that we are within that threshold, but gradual steps, especially if the level of addiction is already that high.
Yeah, okay. So we have to like really step by step go backward until we reach the suggestion time for a specific age.
Right.
Yeah, and how can we explain that to children? Like, you cannot have the amount of time you're having now. You have to have less than that.
Right. And that's one of the things that was kind of a trial and error process for me. So our son is 12, and I talk a lot about his story in my book as well, because this really became apparent to me when he turned 6. And in the book, I talk about all of the scenarios that led me to the realization that he had had too much screens. But I learned even very younger before that, kids that don't understand a lot of rules will always understand safety. And so that has always been my go-to explanation. Even when a child does not understand the rule, they don't like the rule, if a parent says, I'm doing this to keep you safe, kids have this very deep understanding of protection and safety, even at very young ages. That's why you can say to a 2-year-old, you can't run out in the road, that's not safe. They understand being kept safe and the idea of protection. So that is one of the things that I encourage parents to do, is to say, I understand that you've had a lot of screens. I know how much you love playing your games. I know how much you love being on your phone, whatever the device is. But I'm now aware that that is not good for your brain. It's actually damaging to your brain. And it's my job as your parent to keep you safe. And so in order to keep you safe, we're going to change the amount of time that you're allowed to have screens. And obviously you have to say that differently for different developmental ages. So a 3-year-old would be a much simpler explanation, but for a teenager, they can understand the concept of, you have too much, it's damaging to your brain. It's a much more in-depth conversation the older the child is, but safety is at the root of that discussion. It's my job to keep you safe. And I'll say that to my son when he wants to go play in the neighborhood by himself. I'll say, okay, well, I need you to make sure you stay here. Why? I want to go over here. And I'll say, it's my job to keep you safe. I say that all the time. And that is a really easy way to help kids understand there's a why behind the decision. Because when you make a change in your parenting approach, when you make a change in the way that you're going to handle things with kids, it's confusing unless they have the why. And if the why is, I'm keeping you safe, even if they don't like it, they understand it.
That is like that your son ever question, like, why do you have to be keeping me from everything all the day?
Well, often I get the question, well, why can so-and-so do it? And I'll say, well, I'm not so-and-so's mom. But that is definitely a question, yes, because peers look at other peers as to the norm, right? So, well, if everyone else has a phone, why don't I have a phone? If everyone else is allowed to go play on their own, why am I not allowed to? And so he does question the normalcy of my rules, but he does never question me saying it's my job to keep you safe. And in order to keep you safe, I have to say no to that. And so that's the bottom line for him. And to a point now where I'll say, what's my job? And he rolls his eyes and says, to keep me safe. And I'm like, right, it's my job to keep you safe. He knows that now. He understands that. And therefore, there's no argument because kids need to be kept safe and they know that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it will be very interesting. And, you know, for me, it's like a little bit authority, but it's the right amount of time we put in there. Like we don't keep them playing with friends, you know, we just try to like stop something can damage their brain later, and what you mentioned.
Right. And that's it. It's the appropriate amount of authority with the appropriate amount of understanding of where the child is and what they need. And so you walk that fine line of, I don't want to take away everything that matters to you. I understand how important this is to you, but I also have to have boundaries in place to make sure that you're kept safe. And at this point, devices are damaging our children's brains. And so understanding that the damage can be reversed with a reduction in screen exposure, obviously our goal would be to get them to a healthy level to reverse the damage.
Yeah, so you said like it's damaging for the brain. And can you give a little bit more explanation about that, and also how devices or social media have impact on children emotion development?
Sure. So starting with the damage, they've done a lot of research, and it's only really been in the last few years because we've been increasing in our use of devices, but research is just now catching up to the impact of that. So longitudinally, we don't even know, you know, what does a 20-year time frame look like? But we are looking at, you know, a very short window of time in a year or so. What are we looking at? So they've actually done brain scan images. And I talk about several of these studies in the book. It's interesting to look at the images because you can see areas that are either lit up on the scans that show damage, or they are empty on the scans, depending on what level of the brain and what area has been damaged. So we're really talking about the prefrontal cortex that is most highly affected by a lot of screen use, which is our emotional regulation center. So I'll get to that question in just a moment, but prefrontal cortex is a big site of damage. You also have gray matter and white matter damage. And gray and white matter are responsible for different things. And so that is impulse control, that's behavior regulation. There's a lot of things that the gray and the white matter control. And you also have frontal lobe issues when you're in front of a screen too often. So there's actually, you know, scans and images showing the change. And so in this one specific study I saw, they lit up red everywhere there had been atrophy in the gray and the white matter, and the entire brain was red. Every pocket of the brain was lit up red. And then they looked at the reduction of screens, and all of a sudden it healed. So the brain is incredible. I mean, it's such an amazing organ. It can heal and repair with a reduction in use. But without that reduction, the damage continues. And so that's the danger, I feel, is not being aware of finding the threshold. But to speak to how it's affecting our children's emotions, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for emotional regulation, for impulse control, for social interaction, for behavioral regulation. And here's the interesting thing. It develops continually until about the age of 25. So we often think that once our kids are teenagers, if they hit 16, 17, well, they can handle being in front of a screen. They can handle social media. They're almost an adult. What's interesting is developmentally, this continues until 25. So unless you have a child that's 25 or older, their brain is still continuing to develop. So think about the impact of starting a child at 3 years old on screens and excessive use of screens, and then letting that continue as the brain develops another 22, 23 years beyond that. The damage can be exponential, and that's the concern. And so the emotional regulation piece, the more the frontal cortex is damaged, the harder it is for children to regulate. So what often happens, and what parents describe to me a lot, is as soon as I say, okay, that's it, you lose your phone as a punishment, or okay, you're done, you're not allowed to play video games for the rest of the day, they witness this horrific emotional eruption. You know, you've got kids throwing and kicking and screaming and I mean, just losing their minds. And they're like, I've never seen them like this before. And if you understand that scenario and you couple it with prefrontal cortex damage, they don't have the ability to control their emotions. It has been compromised. So children don't naturally regulate their emotions anyway. That's a learned behavior, right? Emotional vocabulary, emotional maturity, it comes with time and with practice. So you're already at a disadvantage with young children not knowing how to control emotions just as a base level. Then you compromise that further with damage. And then you see just these monumental outbursts. And parents are horrified. And I always circle it back to, but it's not that they don't want to regulate. They actually are not able to now. So, and there's a lot of science behind that. A lot of the research has shown that the constant sounds, the constant dings, the constant lights and the stimuli, there's just so much stimulation when kids are watching a screen, especially playing games, that it stresses the nervous system. And so the nervous system is a big piece of this as well. And keep in mind, your emotions are regulated by your nervous system. So and you have two sets of that. You have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I know this is a lot of neurobiology, but it's important to understand because if we don't understand why things are happening, we can't do anything about it. And so your two phases of your nervous system help you regulate your emotions. In other words, fight or flight comes from your nervous system, and your level of stress comes from your nervous system. The cortisol levels in your brain come from your nervous system. So when you have stimulation again and again and again, and all these games with the sounds, the lights, the noises, the notifications, and they're making them so you have to check in. Have you noticed that games and programs and stuff like, don't forget your daily reward, don't forget to unlock this bonus. So it keeps the draw. So they're on longer and longer and longer. And what happens? The nervous system gets overwhelmed. Nervous system gets completely taxed. Then that affects the prefrontal cortex. You put all that together, you have kids that are in a constant state of panic, constant state of fight or flight and stress. So how can you expect them to handle their emotions well? You have to be at a pretty solid mental state to handle your emotions. And they're not able to because it's too much.
Yeah. I mean, I already like learned a little bit about like the brain, as you said, but very basic thing. But what I see from children, and so nowadays, like so many children, they kind of like addicted to social media. TikTok, for example, like I have a cousin, I think she's 8, but she go crazy every day to ask about the phone from the mom, like to make the video on TikTok. And I feel that she has some problem with like concentration at the class and at the school, but the mom doesn't know what to do now. And I see like at this very young age, she start having that. And also I feel like it might have some impact on her self-esteem as well, because she like keep compare herself with other idols or another influencer on social media.
Right. And I think, let me speak to both, because I think both of those are relevant. So yes, we have seen a huge decline in attention, in focus, in concentration. We have kids being diagnosed with ADHD through the roof. We have kids that are on medication for ADHD through the roof. And interestingly, the symptoms, if you look at a diagnostic criteria for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, if you look at that, it mirrors almost identically the symptoms that research is showing are connected to screen use. So you can't focus, you can't sit still, you can't pay attention, you can't concentrate, you don't sleep well, you're constantly bouncing off the walls. It's stimulation. And so they're very closely mirroring each other. And so we're getting all of these children being diagnosed with ADHD, when I would argue that if you take the screen piece out of the puzzle, I actually don't think that they would necessarily meet diagnostic criteria. So yes, academics are suffering. School performance is suffering, the ability to sit and be calm and, work on a project, complete a task, complete a test. I get complaints all the time from parents and teachers. They just can't do their work. They can't sit still. They can't finish the test. Well, when their brain is wired that every few seconds there's something that's supposed to alert them, make them think about something. I mean, it's overwhelming for the nervous system. So yes, school performance absolutely is suffering. The self-esteem issue. There are a lot of studies that are showing, especially girls, not so much for boys, to a degree, yes, but girls for sure, much more. Their entire identity becomes wrapped up in their presence on social media. And so if they don't get enough likes, if they don't get enough signups, if they don't get enough, comments, if everything they do is about getting validation from others. And yes, even what you mentioned, comparing themselves to their influencers, their idols, whatever. It's a constant state of stress and pressure of I have to measure up, I have to succeed, I have to make people like me. And there's no intrinsic motivation. And what I mean by that is we have two areas that can motivate us. We have the external locus of control, meaning we do things because we want other people to acknowledge us, other people to say good job, other people to give us our value. Or we're intrinsically motivated. Internal locus of control says, I want to do this because I want to do it. I'm proud of myself. I'm happy with it no matter what. I'm driven to do it because it matters to me. It has nothing to do with an external communication. So unfortunately, social media is 100% externally driven. And so you are constantly feeling the pressure to live up to these expectations that really don't exist. It's all, it's an awareness of, I want all of this to be true, but none of it is actually true. And so it's this really dangerous situation, especially for girls, because their entire sense of worth and identity and confidence is based in what other people's reactions are. And that ends up meaning that you think that you're worth nothing if you are not validated by someone else. So what happens when someone doesn't validate you? You feel that you have nothing to bring to the table. And that's a really scary spot, especially for young girls who are figuring out who they are. This is the time when they're deciding what their identity is. I'm strong, I'm brave, I'm competent, I'm capable, whatever it is that they're trying to sort out. And when the message is, not enough people liked that video, so I must be an awful person. It's such a slippery slope where they don't have a sense of worth independent of other people's reactions.
Yeah, so I also see that, like validations might take for a long way as well for them when they are grown up. For example, like they always seek out for like approval from people. Like they don't know what they are doing is right or wrong. They need somebody to tell them, like, you are doing a good job, or even they judge themselves, like, you're not good enough, you did it wrong, and you make a mistake, and they never could really develop on the long way.
That's exactly it. And, there's the term people pleaser. And that sense of trying to always please everybody, it's so exhausting. And when you don't have an internal sense of, I accept myself and I'm okay with myself and I value myself regardless of what someone else thinks. We only ever have control over ourselves. I have no control over what anyone else thinks about me. I only have control over what I think about myself. And so that people-pleasing mentality, it's actually developed from that sense of external motivation. I need other people to say good job. I need other people to validate me. I need other people to tell me that I'm worth something. And so that people-pleasing mentality develops absolutely into adulthood. And then as adults, there's no sense of, I'm proud no matter what. I'm fulfilled no matter what. And that actually creates a lot of emotional and relational difficulties long term.
Yeah, so okay, so that is it's a little bit of like a red flag to me, like on the long way is what we really have to keep in mind, and like try to keep our children or even ourselves far away from device as much as possible. But I mean, like even me sometimes, I have to look at my phone, see what happens, and but yeah. And I also think about like, like culture have like different influence on using the device, because, for example, like I came from Asian background, and my mom on Facebook 24/7. I have no idea why she's on there, but she's on Facebook all the time. I mean, like, why do you know that? Why did you do that? Even now, like she's 50 something. But now I'm in Germany, which is like Western people, and I see that they don't really care much about social media. And I guess, like with Asian, we're curious about everything. We want to know what happened on that body. We want to happen what happened in the family, and they live stream all the time. And it's really exhausted for me even to watch that.
Yes. And I agree with you. I think culturally, there's definitely different influences. And so I think in certain parts of the world, a lot of people just really don't have much of a draw for it. And then I think in certain areas, specifically United States and Asia, I would say are the two that tend to be more influenced by the social media and the screen use. And so it's interesting that culturally and globally, there are differences in how much of an impact it has. And I was actually just speaking with someone a couple of weeks ago from Europe, and he said, it's so different in the States because, we don't even have credit cards. Like most people do not own credit cards in Europe. And if you can't pay for it with cash, you don't buy it. And I just thought, isn't that interesting that depending on where you live, the influence of what is normal societally is different. I mean, everyone buys everything on credit cards in the States. So it's just interesting that culturally that does play a factor. And I think the cultures that tend to have more of a bent towards screens, this is the most relevant for them. And, to be aware of, especially kids right now. I mean, our son we just made the decision to homeschool partly because of this, but he was having to do 4 hours of homework a week on screens. And even academics are now pushing being on screens. So you have screens for school, you have screens for pleasure, you have screens for homework, you have screens for games. I mean, we could spend every waking minute on a screen if we wanted to. And that's, I feel, what is being pushed. And so I absolutely agree with you that culturally this is more relevant in the areas of the world where screens seem to be more of a focus.
So how can we help our children to develop their emotional skill during this screening time?
So, I mean, I think that the most simple answer is monitor amount of time that they're in front of a screen. Because I've worked with a lot of families that have had to do, I mean, my book is called Device Detox, but I've watched families have to do an actual detox in their home. And what I mean by that is they got rid of all screens, period. They just said the only way that we're going to get back to normal, we can't scale back from where we are. We have to cold turkey cut it off, and then we can add some back in once it's safe. And I've watched families actually go through that process of every device in the house is locked up and they start over from scratch. Now that's a really extreme case, and those were in really committed families. A lot of families are like, I could never do it. So what I feel is the best way to approach this is figure out what is going to be the threshold for your children. So based on recommendations, based on personality, based on how well they handle screens, because some kids can handle 2 hours of screens, and as soon as you say turn it off, they say okay, and it's not an issue for them at all. And then you give some kids 15 minutes of screens and ask them to turn it off, and they lose their mind. So it's personality, it's age, it's development, it's maturity, it's a lot of things. But that is the start, because they're already going to struggle emotionally no matter what. Screens just make it worse. So to help them get off to a better start, you have to monitor the screens. And then what do you do to help them with their emotions beyond that? A really effective tool that I give to every parent's toolbox is the concept of reflecting feelings. And what that is you meet the child where they are and you tell them what you see them expressing. So for example, your child brings home a paper that they got a good grade on from school and they have a really big smile on their face. Instead of saying, good job, which that goes back to the people-pleasing development, right? Because they think that their value comes from you telling them they did a good job, but that's for another topic. So, but instead of saying good job, you say, you're really proud, or you're so happy, or you're excited, or you're glad. So you give them the emotional word for what they're expressing. So they're holding up a paper smiling, you know that they're happy. You know they're proud, you know they're excited. So you say that back to them. It's called reflecting feelings. And so you do that over time, and they start to identify, okay, I know the word for what I'm feeling right now, and then therefore I can express that to someone else. So let me tease that apart a little bit. It's a two-part process. Emotional vocabulary and emotional maturity is twofold. So first, you have to accurately identify what you're feeling. That's number one. You have to know what you're feeling. So for example, kids get butterflies in their stomachs just like we do. They get endorphins just like we do. They get adrenaline just like we do. They go through the same things in their bodies that we do. Somatically, that's what we call that. So they get butterflies. They will say, my stomach feels weird. I don't feel well. My belly hurts. They feel the sensation, but they don't know what it means. So when a child is nervous, for example, and they get butterflies, if you notice that they're feeling anxious, you notice they're feeling worried, and you say, that's worrying you. There's the accurate identification of the feeling, because they go, oh, when I feel this way inside, now I have the word for it. So reflecting feelings is really important to help them learn to develop that understanding of their feeling. But here's the second part, because there's a lot of adults that stop there. They know what they're feeling, and then they never communicate it to anyone. But a really helpful thought is no one can ever meet your needs unless you tell them what you're feeling. So kids have to be able to then understand their feeling and then communicate it. So then they would say, oh, okay, last time I felt this way, mom, dad, teacher, whomever said I was nervous. So then they say, I'm nervous right now. And there's the accurate and effective communication of the feeling. So emotions are driven internally, and kids have to be able to then externally make sense of what that looks like. So they have to know what they're feeling and then tell someone what they're feeling.
Yeah, so I think it's very important what you just said, for at first, like identify what we are feeling now. And I think it's even for adults, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Right.
We don't have the vocabulary, we don't know about it. Because for example, for me, like you can get mad, but it's different with frustration. It's different. It's like completely different level.
Yes, and I talk about that a lot. I mean, I've taught whole courses on the depth and complexity of emotion. I mean, it's so rich, and we only scratch the surface most of the time. But I say that a lot. You look at categories of feelings. We, as even adults, we as humans, typically default to 4 emotional categories. We say happy, mad, sad, scared. Those are the 4 broad categories that we fall into. So what are you right now? I'm mad. What are you right now? I'm happy. But you're not really. You might be frustrated. You might be disappointed. You might be annoyed. You might be, there's so many within the mad category that are more accurate. You know, are you happy? No, you're probably proud. You're probably excited. You're probably filled with joy. There's so many facets within those categories, but we default to the broad. So that's exactly it. We say, no, I'm mad right now. Well, if we actually took the time to figure out what it is that we truly are, which is how the reflecting feeling skill is so effective. Because when someone, I mean, imagine this, you are in a bad mood and someone says, yeah, that was probably really disappointing. Isn't that totally different when someone actually recognizes that you're disappointed than just blowing it off as, oh, well, she's in a bad mood? Because understanding that disappointment is very different than all the other feelings that they might have been feeling. And so to be able to pinpoint that either personally or have someone else do that for us, there's a lot of value in that. And the differentiation between the emotions only grows with practice.
Yeah, and I think it's also, that is definitely a very good point. And the other one is you said like accurate communications, because it's come from both sides. Like when parents communicate even with each other, with their spouse, they don't so I hear most of the time they say, for example, I ask some parent like, how are you today? The answer is, I'm okay. I say, sorry, okay, it's not the emotion. Okay, it's this very convenient way to answer, but it doesn't tell me anything.
Right.
Or they
And
say
I
like,
use the example all the time. People that giggle when they're nervous. I use that as an illustration because I say that's a lack of emotional vocabulary. They don't find anything funny. You know,
yeah,
nothing about that situation is funny, but they don't either know how to effectively identify what they're feeling, or they don't know how to accurately communicate what they're feeling. It's a two-part process, and some don't do either, and some only do one and not the other. So people that get angry and punch their fist through a wall, that is lack of emotional vocabulary. You probably knew you were angry, but you didn't know how to communicate it appropriately.
yeah,
So you would absolutely have to have both pieces of the puzzle. And you bring up a really effective point. Adults have to work on this too. Yes, of course, kids develop, but there are lots of adults in this world that don't do this well. So you're not born with these skills. You have to practice them. You have to learn them. You have to understand them. And that takes time and it takes intention.
yeah. I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really, really important. Like, before you teach the child, you have to teach yourself first. Like, you cannot answer all the time, I feel normal, I feel okay, I feel uncomfortable. For me, it's not feeling at all. It's just what happens. It's a fact.
Right. And that's it. I think especially in the States, I don't know, maybe in other parts of the world, people are more open, but I feel like for us, we tend to downplay if we're not in a good place. So fine, good, okay are our go-to how are you answers when we don't want to say, I'm overwhelmed, I'm exhausted, I'm frustrated, I'm just having a rough day. It's like we try to hide the raw emotion that we're actually feeling, and we kind of just brush it off and say, "Oh, I'm all right." Well, I think it's in an attempt to spare the person that's asking from the truth, but the reality is that conditions us to not really understand our emotions and not communicate them well. Because if we always blow off that question with, "Oh, I'm fine," but we never take the time to actually survey what we're actually feeling. Like, no, I'm not fine. I'm actually, and then you have that moment where you have to decide what's the best emotion to represent where I am right now. And again, that just takes a lot of rehearsal and a lot of digging inside to say, it's not actually that, it's actually this. And that is work. And I think some people, it's just easier to say, oh, I'm okay.
Yeah, but for me, it sounds a little bit weird for me, like when you said you don't know about the other culture, but for me, 7 8, and even here in Europe, we believe that American people are one of the most open people in the world.
Oh,
That's what I hear all the time. And now you say, no, we are not.
well, okay, let me clarify. I would agree with you. We emote on a much greater level than a lot of other cultures. So I
Yeah.
agree. We're kind of like you what you see is what you get. Like that is very much how the way we are. However, I think we try to fake good. And what I mean by that is if we're struggling, we don't feel like the world needs to know that. So we'll put on a brave front. We'll put on a face that says I'm fine, even when I'm actually not. So the question, how are you? I think that's where we shelter people from the truth. I think, if we were being really honest and really open, we would say, I'm falling apart right now. Like this is happening. There's all these things going on in my world, and I'm not having a great time. However, the easy answer is I'm okay. So I think it's more about protecting people from the reality of the depth of how much we're struggling, maybe. But I think just universally, yes, we are very, take us as you see us, people.
Yeah, but I think it says at the beginning you don't aware of that, but the more you say it, like the more it's become like kind of it's kind of become like the norm, or like how you usually respond, and you ignore your real emotions, and it's not really good for yourself. It's not, I don't know what other thing, but for myself it's not good.
Right. That's it. And I think it's not only that it's not good for us, it's not good for our relationships. You know, when you have a relationship with someone, and even if it's just kind of a, you know, a casual relationship,
Mm,
you never develop connection when there isn't truth and realness there.
mm,
And so, you know, if you just kind of give that pacifying answer all the time, like, oh, I'm fine, the other person never fully understands where you are. And so I
mm.
think that creates a barrier, and that's that emotional IQ. We talk about that a lot, like your emotional quotient, your emotional IQ. You have to be able to put yourself out there emotionally to have people respond to that. And when
Mm,
you don't, it kind of creates that obstacle for true connection.
mm.
And that's true between parents and children too. You know, if parents are doing that with their kids and kids are doing that with their parents, what kind of meaningful
Yeah.
awareness and connection and relationship is being developed? It's all on a superficial level.
Yeah. So I guess for like communication, like sometimes parents very busy. They don't have time to listen to their child's emotions. So they ask the child came back from school, like, how are you today? What is there anything happened at the school? And they said, it's all fine. And then the conversation ended. I mean, I
Right.
see that every day.
Yes. And so here's my antidote to that. I have a simple fix. So children do not do well with broad, abstract questions. So, how was your day? Is I mean, a day feels like an eternity to a child, right? So, how
Mm,
was your day? How can they possibly know how to answer that other than fine, good, okay? Because there's nothing concrete about it. So, a much
mm,
more effective question for parents to ask is tell me one thing that happened today. Or
mm,
what was your favorite part of school? Or tell me something funny that happened. Notice how all of a sudden, when you have a very concrete one question and
mm,
one answer, the child will almost always comply. And then you get way more information than you would have otherwise. So, for example, and I actually wrote a blog post about this a while back because we got in the car, picked our son up from school. My husband says, how was your day? And our son was like, good. And I looked at my husband and I was like, no, that is not going to cut it. So I turned around and I said, what was something really funny that happened today? And he's like, oh my gosh, at lunch, this happened and this happened. And my husband looked at me like that was magic. I don't know what just happened. And I wrote a blog post about it later because I said, if you don't understand the way that children think and the way children feel, it's
mm,
really hard to communicate with them because they're not verbal. They're not verbal beings. They are
mm,
emotional beings. So you have to tap into the emotion because something that's funny was emotional. Something that was
mm,
memorable was emotional. Their favorite thing that happened was emotional. So if you can connect on the emotion, all of a sudden they have all kinds of stuff they want to share versus how was your day? Fine. Did you
yeah.
have a good day at school? Yep. Well, you're not getting any connection there. But when you give them a concrete prompt, all of a sudden they're like, oh, of course I can tell you what was funny. I have a whole story about it. And then what do you do when they share the story? You reflect the feeling to
Mm.
give them the opportunity to share more. So, oh my gosh, that must have been so fun. Yeah, because, and then they tell you more. So that becomes the gateway for you to just continue to use that reflecting feeling skill after that.
Wow, yeah, for me it's a $1 million point. Well, that what is the share? It's very, I mean, so basically I think in another language, that would be like we have to speak the language as the child. We cannot say
Yes.
like, yeah, you we don't I mean we cannot talk to a child like talk to our peer because they are not on the same level
Right.
of the
And I
message
think
as
that's where a lot of parents struggle because I think, unfortunately, children get lumped into the little human category, like, oh, you're just a
mm,
little human, rather than a child,
mm,
because children develop mentally, socially, emotionally, mentally, everything. They're different. They're
mm,
not like little adults. They are children. And so they don't have abstract reasoning. They don't know how to rationalize. They don't know how to think. So for example, when kids are asked, why did you do that? You know,
mm,
they pick up a shoe and they throw it. because they wanted to see how far it could go. I don't know. They're impulsive, right? And so they do this random thing, and parents or adults say, why did you do that? The most honest, normal answer is, I don't know. And then that frustrates adults, because adults are like, what do you mean you don't know? You threw it. The thing is, they didn't know why, because they didn't think. Knowing is cognitive. They felt. They're emotional. They had an impulse. They chucked the shoe. There was no thought related to it whatsoever. So interacting with a child in an adult-like way, which is logical, rational, cognitive, children are none of those things. So why did you do that? I don't know. Parents get annoyed by that answer, but it's a true answer. They didn't know anything. They just felt, and they did, because they're here and now, they're emotional. And so in the moment, it was an impulse. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to satisfy adults, because they want to know the why. And the why is, there was no why, it was emotional. And that's the difference of speaking a child's language. That's why you have to meet them where they are, because they can't meet us where we are. They're not cognitive. So we can't expect them to rise to a cognitive level, but we can go to an emotional level.
Yeah, so the key for that is asking concrete questions, like make it small, so they can focus on what we expect from what we expect they answer. And yeah, so this is my curiosity. Should we ask yes, no question, like leading questions, or open-ended questions?
So open-ended questions are always the most helpful for giving the child the outlet to express their emotions, because remember, they're not cognitive. So yes and no questions, we call those closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions are usually a more rational, cognitive type of question. However, if you ask an open-ended question, such as, how was your day? It's too broad. So you kind of have to balance an open-ended question with something very concrete. So you don't particularly want a yes or no answer. Did you have fun today? Yes. Well, you get nothing out of that conversation. But what was the funniest thing that happened today? It's open-ended, but it's also concrete. So you kind of want to fuse those two together so that you get the information and the connection that you want, but you still don't force them into a cognitive question.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting what you just shared to me today. I feel like my mind is, blew away, and it's wow, it's a lot of information, and I just feel like we almost come to an end, like, because what you shared was too interesting for me, and I'm just went with the flow. And it's very, very interesting. And so yeah, it's really like, do you have any last piece of advice for parents now today, how to connect with your child on their emotions, and also kind of ignore the device a little bit more?
Sure. So really, I mean, I mentioned, but I'll kind of summarize, because I think it's helpful to have a little bit of a recap.
Yeah.
So the reflecting feeling skill is going to be your go-to. So anytime your child expresses an emotion, and here's a noteworthy point, children will almost always express their emotions non-verbally. So you can't expect them to communicate what they're feeling by words. They're going to communicate what they're feeling by actions and behaviors. So the smile, the jumping up and down, the frown, the tears, the slump, whatever the body language tells us, that gives us the cue. It's usually not them telling us what they're feeling. So when they express these feelings, it's our job to say, you, feeling word, qualifier. So let me share what that might look like. You're frustrated that the toy broke. You, emotion, you're frustrated, qualifier, about what? So you're frustrated the toy broke, or you're proud that you built a tower, or you're sad that your hamster died. Whatever the scenario is, you say you, feeling word, qualifier. Why is that important? Because you, starting the sentence with you, makes it very clear that you understand what's going on with the child. Because we're notorious for using I statements. So we say, I can tell that, I see that, I understand that, I bet that. So we preface almost everything with an I, which makes it about us. And if we're trying to connect with our kids and we're trying to connect to their feelings, we have to say you. So you are sad, you are proud, you are happy, you are annoyed, you are whatever. So you feeling word qualifier, that is the go-to. Connect with your kids, help them feel heard, help them feel understood, help them feel validated. And especially if the child is expressing something negative. So on the negative emotional scale, just reflecting their feeling diffuses the intensity of the feeling. If you do nothing else, them just feeling understood, like, you're really mad. Yes, there's a release for a child to say, okay, they get it. They understand, they are with me in this moment. And so it diffuses the intensity just by doing that. So the reflecting feeling skill is huge. That's kind of a go-to tool in your toolbox. And then understanding that the more they are on screens, the more they're going to suffer emotionally. So they're going to suffer with their emotional control, with their emotional regulation, with their relational emotions. Like you take something away, they're going to blow up. Yes, of course, because screens damage all of the parts of the brain that help with that. So, yes, you want to start with reflecting feelings, but you also want to understand that screens are only going to compromise the work that you're doing if they're not at a manageable level. So, get yourself an idea of what you want for your child. Like, I only want them to be on an hour of screens a day. And then you work to get to that point. And in my book, I talk about a lot of techniques to do that. There's lots of ways you can get there, but the bottom line is you have to have the plan. And so go into it with an idea. This is where I want to be. And then these are the steps that I'm going to take to get there. Because you're right, if you just yank all screens away, it's going to be really tough. But understanding the benefit of the relationship and the connection that is built when they're not being compromised by screens, it's worth it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And the very last question, what if somebody wants to reach out to you or find out more about your works and listen more about you? Where could they find the information? I will put all the links on the screen.
Okay, so my podcast, which I put out usually every week, and that is the Play Therapy Parenting Podcast. So if you go to playtherapyparentingpodcast.com, they can find all of the archived episodes there, and the most current episode is always at the top. So that's a really helpful place for that. I also have a bonus giveaway. So if you'd like to offer that, I think that would be great for people, especially that want to dive in deeper to some of the play therapy skills. So on playtherapyparenting.com/4pillars. So that's the number 4 and then the word pillars. There are 4 main pillars of play therapy. That's what we call them. And so reflecting feelings is one of those. And so I feel like that would be a really helpful resource. So anyone who, is watching this, they'll have access to that. I think that'll be helpful. But my book is called Device Detox, and that is available on Amazon. That's in printed book and ebook. So whichever one is better, they're both available. And then brennahicks.com is another option. That's kind of just my hub of all things that I do. So those are the main ways. But I think obviously the podcast is going to be practical advice for parents and, just the play therapy based skills that parents can use on a daily basis.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I bet that my audience also learned a lot from you, and so do I. And thank you so much for your time with me today and for your very valuable sharing.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And I wish you a happy New Year's and all the best for 2022.
Yes, you too. Thanks so much.
Thank you.